The autumn sunlight streaming through the barn doors caught the delicate lace of Maria Santos's wedding dress as she walked down the aisle, her hand resting gently on the slight swell of her belly. The congregation of Esperanza's finest citizens rose to their feet, smiling at the radiant bride and her handsome groom who waited at the makeshift altar, with tears of joy glistening in his steel-gray eyes. It was, by every measure, a perfect wedding. Thomas Santos stood tall and proud in his finest Western wear, a crisp white shirt beneath a perfectly tailored brown leather vest, his dark hair neatly combed and his beard trimmed to perfection. The orange marigolds pinned to his lapel matched the vibrant autumn bouquet in his bride's hands. And when Maria reached his side, the love that passed between them was so pure and powerful that several women in the congregation dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs. "Dearly beloved," began Reverend Morrison, his voice carrying easily through the converted barn that served as Esperanza's chapel, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of Maria Elena Santos and Thomas James Santos in holy matrimony." Maria's fingers tightened around her bouquet of orange dahlias and deep red roses, the same wildflowers that grew abundantly around their little house on the outskirts of town. She was known throughout the community as the finest healer in 3 counties, a woman whose gentle hands could coax life back into the most grievously wounded souls. Thomas was respected as an honest horse trader and occasional deputy, a man whose quiet strength and unwavering integrity had earned him the trust of every rancher and merchant in the territory. They were the kind of couple that small frontier communities treasured, hard-working, devoted to each other, and blessed with the promise of new life growing between them. The perfect example of how love could flourish even in the harsh wilderness of the American West. But as Maria gazed into Thomas's eyes and whispered her wedding vows, her mind drifted for just a moment to the weight of the secret they shared. 6 months ago, she hadn't been Maria Santos at all. 6 months ago, she'd been Elena Rodriguez, a lonely healer living in a cabin outside Deadwood Gulch, Arizona territory. And the man she was marrying hadn't been the respectable Thomas Santos, who now traded horses and kept the peace. 6 months ago, he'd been Cord Iron Wolf Maverick, the most wanted outlaw in 3 territories, with a $5,000 bounty on his head and more blood on his hands than most men accumulated in 3 lifetimes of violence. 6 months ago, Maria Santos hadn't existed. Elena Rodriguez had been carefully extracting an Apache arrow from the back of a dying gunfighter, while bounty hunters circled her home like wolves scenting prey. She'd been making the choice that would transform them both from strangers bound by desperation into partners bound by a love deeper than either had dared to dream possible. But that was 6 months ago. Today, surrounded by their new community and bathed in golden sunlight, Maria and Thomas Santos were simply 2 people promising to love each other until death parted them, never knowing how close death had already come to claiming them both. The Reverend's voice brought Maria back to the present moment, to the warm hand holding hers, and the future they were building together. "You may kiss your bride." And as Thomas's lips met hers in their first kiss as husband and wife, Maria thought that sometimes the most perfect endings required the most imperfect beginnings. 6 months earlier, Elena Rodriguez had always been an early riser, but the sound that jolted her awake at dawn wasn't the usual desert wind or coyote call. It was the heavy thud of something, or someone, hitting her cabin door hard enough to rattle the hinges. She slipped from her bed, reaching instinctively for the shotgun her father had taught her to use before fever took him 3 years prior. Living alone as the only trained healer within 50 miles of Deadwood Gulch meant being prepared for anything: Apache raids, rattlesnake bites, gunshot wounds, or any of the 100 ways the Arizona territory could try to kill a person. But nothing had prepared her for the sight that greeted her when she cautiously opened the door. A man lay crumpled against the wooden frame, his face pressed into the dust, a steady pool of blood spreading beneath him. An Apache arrow protruded from his back between the shoulder blades, its eagle feathers stark against his torn shirt. His breathing was shallow and labored, each exhale stirring the dirt beneath his face in small puffs. Elena's medical training overrode her fear immediately. She dropped to her knees beside him, her fingers finding the pulse at his neck, weak but steady. His skin burned with fever but felt clammy from blood loss, a dangerous combination that told her he didn't have much time. "Can you hear me?" she asked, gently turning his head so his face wasn't buried in the dirt. "I'm going to help you." The man's eyes fluttered open, steel gray eyes that seemed to look right through her, even in his semi-conscious state. There was something dangerous in those eyes, something that made her suddenly aware of how isolated her cabin was, how vulnerable she was. But there was also pain, and Elena Rodriguez had never turned away from pain, no matter how dangerous its source. "I need to get you inside," she said, though she wasn't sure he could understand her. "This is going to hurt." Getting a full-grown man who was dead weight into her cabin should have been impossible for someone of Elena's size, but desperation gave her strength she didn't know she possessed. She managed to drag him across the threshold and onto the thick rug in front of her fireplace, leaving a trail of blood she'd worry about cleaning later. The arrow was buried deep, missing his heart and lungs by what looked like mere inches. The shaft had penetrated so far that only about 6 inches protruded from his back, and Elena could see that the arrowhead had gone completely through. The tip was barely visible, pressing against the skin of his chest. She'd removed arrows before, but never one buried this deep in such a dangerous location. One wrong move could sever an artery or puncture a lung. Her hands trembled slightly as she gathered her instruments: a sharp knife, metal forceps, clean cloth for bandages, and a bottle of whiskey that would serve as both anesthetic and disinfectant. The man drifted in and out of consciousness as she worked, sometimes gritting his teeth against the pain, sometimes falling completely limp. Elena found herself talking to him as she cut away his blood-soaked shirt, partly to keep him conscious and partly to calm her own nerves. "You're lucky the arrow didn't hit anything vital," she murmured, carefully cleaning the blood away from the wound site. "Though I suppose luck is relative when you're lying on a stranger's floor with a patchy steel in your back." As she exposed his torso, Elena's breath caught. This was a man who had lived a hard life. Old scars crisscrossed his chest and shoulders, some from knives, others that looked like bullet wounds. But it was the tattoo on his left shoulder that made her pause. A wolf's head, intricately detailed and surrounded by barbed wire. She'd seen that marking before, whispered about in saloons and general stores. It was the kind of tattoo that spoke of affiliations she'd rather not think about. "Focus," she told herself. "Whatever he's done, right now he needs a doctor, not a judge." The extraction took nearly an hour. Elena had to widen the entry wound slightly to get a good grip on the arrow shaft, then carefully work it back through the tissue, watching for any sign that she was causing more damage. The man gritted his teeth and gripped the rug beneath him until his knuckles went white, but he never cried out. When the arrow finally came free with a wet, sucking sound, Elena felt relief flood through her. The man's breathing immediately became easier, and some of the gray pallor left his face. "The worst is over," she told him, pressing clean cloth against both wounds to control the bleeding. "Now I need to clean these out and stitch you up." The whiskey made him hiss when she poured it over the wounds, his back arching off the rug. His eyes snapped, fully alert for the first time since she'd found him. "Easy," Elena said softly. "I know it burns, but it'll keep infection away." Those steel gray eyes fixed on her face, studying her with an intensity that made her suddenly aware again of how vulnerable she was. She was alone with a wounded stranger whose scars suggested he was intimately familiar with violence. If he wanted to hurt her, there would be no one to hear her scream. But something in his gaze wasn't threatening. Pain, yes. Wariness, certainly. But also something that looked almost like gratitude. "Thank you," he managed to whisper, his voice rough as sandpaper. Elena's hands stilled for a moment. Such simple words, but the way he said them, with genuine emotion beneath the pain, made her chest tighten unexpectedly. "Don't thank me yet," she replied, threading her needle. "I still have to sew you back together." The stitching was delicate work. Elena had to close both the entry and exit wounds, making sure the sutures would hold but wouldn't restrict his movement once he began to heal. Her patient remained remarkably still throughout the process, though she could see the muscles in his jaw working as he fought against the pain. By the time she finished, the sun was high overhead and Elena was exhausted. She'd used nearly all of her clean bandages to wrap his torso, and the stranger was finally sleeping deeply. Real sleep, not the unconsciousness of blood loss and shock. Elena sat back on her heels and really looked at him for the first time. Cleaned of blood and dirt, she could see that he was a handsome man, probably in his early 30s, with dark hair that curled slightly where it touched his collar. His face was lean and angular, marked by deep lines that came from years of squinting into sun and wind. Even unconscious, there was something dangerous about him, something that spoke of a life lived outside the boundaries of civilized society. But there was also something else, a quality she couldn't quite name that made her want to smooth the worry lines from his forehead, to chase away whatever demons haunted his dreams. Elena shook her head, trying to dispel such foolish thoughts. She was a healer, nothing more. She'd patched him up, and when he was strong enough to travel, he'd move on. That was how it worked with all her patients. She cleaned up the blood as best she could and put her medical supplies away, then settled into her rocking chair to keep watch. Someone who'd taken an Apache arrow was probably being hunted, and that meant danger might be coming to her doorstep. As evening shadows began to creep across the cabin floor, Elena found herself studying his face again. He looked younger in sleep, less hard-edged and dangerous. She wondered what his story was, what had brought him to her door more dead than alive. She had no way of knowing that she was looking at the face of the most wanted man in 3 territories, or that before the week was out, her own face would be on wanted posters beside his. She had no way of knowing that the simple act of opening her door to a dying stranger would transform her from Elena Rodriguez, respected healer, into Maria Santos, outlaw's woman. All she knew was that she'd saved a life today, and that somehow in the space between extracting that arrow and watching him sleep peacefully by her fire, everything about her orderly, predictable world had begun to change. Outside her cabin, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, and somewhere in the distance, 3 men with badges and guns were following a trail of blood that led straight to her door. Elena woke to the sound of her patient trying to sit up, his sharp intake of breath cutting through the pre-dawn quiet. She dozed fitfully in her chair throughout the night, the shotgun still across her lap, starting awake every time he shifted or groaned. "Don't," she said quickly, setting the gun aside and moving to kneel beside him. "You'll tear your stitches." He'd managed to prop himself up on one elbow, his face pale with effort and beaded with sweat. Those steel-gray eyes were fully alert now, scanning the cabin with the careful assessment of someone accustomed to waking up in unfamiliar places. "Where am I?" His voice was stronger than it had been yesterday, though still rough. "My cabin, about 5 miles south of Deadwood Gulch," Elena replied, gently but firmly pushing him back down. "You collapsed at my door yesterday morning with an Apache arrow in your back. You've lost a lot of blood." He studied her face for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether she was telling the truth. "You're a doctor?" "Close enough. My father was a physician back in San Antonio. He taught me everything he knew before the fever took him." Elena moved to prepare some broth. "What's your name?" The question hung in the air longer than it should have. Elena glanced back to see him staring at the ceiling, his jaw working as if he was chewing on his answer. "Cord," he said finally. "Cord Maverick." Elena nodded, ladling warm broth into a cup. "Well, Mr. Maverick, you're lucky to be alive. That arrow missed your heart by about 2 inches. How did you end up with Apache steel in your back?" "Wrong place, wrong time," he replied, accepting the cup with hands that shook slightly. "Seems to be a habit of mine." There was something in his tone that told Elena there was much more to the story. "Can you tell me how long ago it happened?" Cord sipped the broth slowly. "Day before yesterday, I think. Maybe longer. Time gets fuzzy when you're trying not to bleed to death. If he'd been wounded 2 days ago and made it this far, he was tougher than most men. But it also meant he'd been riding with an arrow in his back for nearly 48 hours. "Where's your horse?" she asked. "Dead. Ran her into the ground trying to get somewhere safe." He met her eyes and she saw genuine regret there. She was a good horse. Deserved better. The way he said it, with grief for the animal he'd lost, made Elena's chest tighten. Whatever else this man might be, he wasn't entirely heartless. As she cooked eggs and bacon, Elena found herself stealing glances at her patient. His clothes, though torn and blood-stained, had been well made. His boots were expensive leather, and his gun belt bore the kind of tool work that spoke of serious money. But it was his hands that really caught her attention. They were scarred and calloused, but the calluses weren't in the right places for a rancher or farmer. They were positioned exactly where years of drawing and firing a gun would leave their mark. Elena tried to push down the unease growing in her stomach. Plenty of men on the frontier made their living with iron on their hip. It didn't necessarily mean he was a criminal. She was setting food beside him when the sound of horses approaching made them both freeze. Multiple riders moving fast. "Expecting company?" Cord asked, his voice suddenly deadly quiet, his hand instinctively reaching for where his gun should be. Elena moved to the window and peered through the curtains. 3 men were riding hard toward her cabin, their horses lathered with sweat. She recognized the lead rider, Tom Bradley, a bounty hunter who occasionally passed through Deadwood Gulch. "Bounty hunters," she said, her mouth going dry. She felt rather than saw Cord trying to sit up again. "Elena," he said, and the way he said her name made her turn. "I need you to listen very carefully. Those men aren't here for a social visit. They're looking for someone." "Who are they looking for?" But even as she asked, Elena was beginning to understand. "Me." The simple word hit her like a physical blow. Bounty hunters only pursued men with prices on their heads. "What did you do?" she whispered. "It's complicated." Cord was struggling to his feet, ignoring her protests. "Right now, what matters is that you're in danger just by helping me." A sharp knock cut him off. "Mrs. Rodriguez?" "It's Tom Bradley. Need to have a word with you." Elena's heart hammered against her ribs. She looked at Cord, who had gone completely still, every muscle coiled like a spring. Despite his wounds, he looked like the most dangerous man she'd ever seen. "The back room," she whispered. "Hide behind the wardrobe." Cord shook his head. "I won't put you in more danger." "Go," Elena repeated firmly. For a moment she thought he might argue, but then he nodded and moved as quietly as his injuries allowed. Elena waited until she heard the soft sound of the wardrobe being moved, then opened the door. Tom Bradley was exactly as she remembered, thin and wiry with pale eyes and a scraggly beard. The 2 men flanking him looked like they'd been carved from granite. "Mr. Bradley," Elena said, keeping her voice steady, "what brings you out this way?" "Tracking a wounded man, ma'am." Dangerous outlaw name of Cord Maverick. Goes by Iron Wolf in some circles. Bradley's eyes scanned past her into the cabin. "Word is he took an Apache arrow couple days back." Elena's blood turned to ice. Iron Wolf. She'd heard that name whispered from here to California. He was supposed to be one of the deadliest gunfighters alive. "I haven't seen anyone matching that description," she managed. Bradley stepped closer. "You sure about that, ma'am?" "Man's got a $5,000 bounty on his head. Dead or alive. $5,000. Elena's mind reeled. That was more money than most people saw in 5 years. One of Bradley's companions spoke up. "Mind if we take a look around?" Elena's heart pounded. "Actually, I do mind. This is my home." Bradley's smile was like a razor blade. "Well now, ma'am, we got cause. We followed a blood trail that leads right to your door." Elena felt the world tilt. She'd forgotten about the trail Cord would have left. "I did treat someone," she admitted. "A cowhand who'd been gored by a bull. But he left yesterday evening." "Funny thing," the 3rd bounty hunter said, pulling out a piece of paper. "This here's a wanted poster. Take a look at that face." Elena's hands trembled as she took the poster. The face staring back at her was unmistakably Cord's. The text below made her knees weak. "Wanted dead or alive, Cord Iron Wolf. Maverick murder, armed robbery, cattle rustling $5,000. Reward so," Bradley said softly. "Want to try that story again?" Because lying to bounty hunters could make you an accessory after the fact. Elena stared at the poster, her mind reeling. The man she'd saved was apparently one of the most wanted criminals in the territory. Everything she thought she knew had been a lie. But even as that realization hit her, another thought surfaced. If these men found him, they would kill him. And despite everything, despite the lies and the wanted poster, Elena discovered she wasn't ready to let that happen. "Like I said," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "I treated a cowhand with a bull goring. Nothing more." Bradley's eyes narrowed. "We'll be watching, ma'am. And if Iron Wolf shows his face around here, That $5,000 says we'll know about it. After they left, Elena found Cord sitting behind the wardrobe, his face gray with pain and something that looked like shame. "It's true," she said quietly. "You really are Iron Wolf Maverick." "Yes." The poster said murder, armed robbery, cattle rustling. Cord met her eyes. "Elena, I need you to understand something. Those men will kill you if they think you're helping me. You should turn me in." "Is it true? Did you do those things?" Cord was quiet for a long moment. Then he began to speak, his voice heavy with old pain. "3 years ago, I was a deputy marshal in Tucson. Had a badge, a steady job, even a girl I was thinking about marrying. I believed in justice." His voice grew bitter. "Turns out justice is only as good as the men enforcing it." Elena listened as he told her about Vincent Hardwick, about corruption and frame-ups and a system that had betrayed him. When he finished, she sat in silence, processing everything. "If you're innocent, why don't you turn yourself in? Clear your name? With what proof? I'm worth $5,000 dead to anyone who brings me in." Cord shook his head. "Even if I could prove my innocence, there are too many people who profit from keeping me wanted." Elena stood and began putting away her medical supplies, her mind churning. The logical thing would be to wait until dark, then signal the bounty hunters. Turn him in, collect the reward, get on with her life. But as she looked at Cord, she saw not the dangerous outlaw from the poster, but a man who'd been betrayed by the system he'd tried to serve. "Those bounty hunters aren't going anywhere," she said finally. "They're watching, which means you can't leave until you're healed." "Elena, you don't know what you're saying. If you help me, you become an outlaw too." Elena thought about her quiet life, her reputation, the safety she'd built. Then she thought about the man before her, wounded, haunted, but still trying to protect her. "Then I guess you'd better teach me how to be one." Over the next 3 days, Elena learned what it meant to live with a wanted man. Every sound outside her cabin, a horse's whinny, the crack of a branch, even the wind rattling the shutters, sent tension through both of them like electricity. Cord insisted on staying near the back window where he could watch the approaches, despite Elena's protests that he needed rest to heal properly. The bounty hunters had made camp about half a mile away, just visible through Elena's field glasses. They weren't bothering to hide their presence. Quite the opposite. They wanted Elena to know they were watching, waiting for any sign that she was harboring their quarry. "They're playing a waiting game," Cord explained as Elena changed his bandages on the third morning. The wounds were healing cleanly, but he was still far from his full strength. "Bradley knows I'm here, but he can't prove it, so he's hoping I'll get impatient and make a mistake." Elena carefully cleaned around the stitches, noting with relief that there was no sign of infection. "How long will they wait?" "As long as it takes. $5,000 buys a lot of patience." Elena had been thinking about that number. $5,000. It represented more money than she'd see in years of healing, enough to buy a house in San Francisco or fund a real medical practice with proper equipment, enough to change her entire life. But every time the thought crossed her mind, she found herself looking at Cord and remembering the way he'd grieved for his horse or how he'd tried to protect her even when he could barely stand. The man she was coming to know bore little resemblance to the cold-blooded killer described on that wanted poster. "Tell me the rest," she said quietly as she began rewrapping his torso, "about what really happened in Tucson." Cord was silent for so long that Elena thought he might refuse. Then slowly he began to speak. "Vincent Hardwick owned half of southern Arizona territory. Cattle, land, politicians. If it had value, he either owned it or controlled it. But he wanted more. There were small ranchers scattered throughout his territory, families who'd been working their land for years. Hardwick decided their property would be better served as part of his empire." Elena's hands stilled on the bandages. "What did he do?" "Started with legal pressure, trumped up debts, tax assessments, anything to force them out. When that didn't work, he escalated. Cattle poisoned, wells fouled, barns burned. Still the families held on." Cord's voice grew harder. "So Hardwick brought in professionals, gunmen who specialized in making problems disappear. And you investigated?" "I tried. But every time I got close to real evidence, witnesses would disappear or change their stories. The local sheriff was in Hardwick's pocket, and the territorial marshal's office was either corrupt or overwhelmed. Cord met her eyes. Then the Kellys were murdered. Elena's breath caught. The Kelly family? Irish immigrants. Good people trying to make an honest living on a patch of land they'd bought fair and square. Hardwick wanted their water rights. Cord's jaw tightened. They were found shot dead in their own home. All of them. Parents, 3 children, even the grandmother. Elena felt sick. And nothing was done? Official story was that Apache raiders did it, but I knew better. The wounds were from white men's weapons, and the attack was too precise, too targeted. This wasn't a raid, it was an execution. What did you do? Spent weeks gathering evidence. Interviewed survivors from other attacks. Tracked down one of Hardwick's gunmen, who was willing to talk for immunity. Built a case that should have sent Hardwick to the gallows. Cord's laugh was bitter. Thought justice would finally be served. Elena resumed bandaging, her hands gentle despite the anger building in her chest. But it wasn't. The night before Hardwick's arrest, someone broke into the jail and shot him dead. When the sheriff arrived, he found me standing over the body with a smoking gun. Said I'd been paid by Hardwick's competitors to eliminate him before he could implicate them. But that wasn't true. No, I'd been set up. Someone who knew about my investigation. Someone with access to the jail. Cord touched his wolf tattoo absently. The sheriff claimed I'd gone rogue, that I couldn't be trusted. Before I knew it, I was the one in chains. Elena finished the bandaging and sat back. How did you escape? A friend helped me. Someone who knew the truth but couldn't speak publicly. He got me out, gave me this tattoo to mark me as Apache kin. Protection in the desert. Told me to run and never stop running. The wolf tattoo isn't just decoration. My mother was half Apache, though I didn't learn that until she was dying. The wolf was her clan symbol. Cord's expression softened. Running Wolf, they called her. She left the reservation to marry my father, but her people never forgot her. Elena absorbed this information, understanding now why Cord had survived so long in hostile territory. And since then, 3 years of being hunted. Every crime that couldn't be solved got blamed on Iron Wolf Maverick. Bank robberies, cattle rustling, murders. If there was no other suspect, it must have been me. Cord met her eyes. I won't lie to you, Elena. I've stolen food when I was starving. I've taken horses when I needed to escape. And I've killed men, but only when they were trying to kill me first. Elena stood and moved to the window, watching the distant camp of bounty hunters. The friend who helped you escape, what happened to him? Shot in the back 6 months later. Persons unknown. Cord's voice was flat. Anyone who tries to help me ends up dead or ruined. That's why you need to turn me in. Elena turned back to face him. No. Elena, you don't understand. I understand perfectly. Elena crossed the room and knelt beside his chair. I understand that you were framed for trying to do the right thing. I understand that the system failed you and that you've been running ever since from a crime you didn't commit. She took his hands in hers. And I understand that if I turn you in, you'll die for someone else's sins. Cord stared at her, something vulnerable flickering in his steel-gray eyes. Why? Why risk everything for a man you barely know? Elena considered the question. Why was she willing to throw away her safe, respectable life for this wounded stranger? The logical answer was that she couldn't live with herself if she sent an innocent man to his death. But as she looked into Cord's eyes, Elena realized it was more than that. Because you're not just any man, she said softly. You're a man who grieved for a horse that died trying to save your life. You're someone who tried to protect me even when you could barely stand. You're a person who spent years fighting for justice, even when it cost you everything. Cord's hands tightened around hers. Elena. And because, she continued, her voice barely above a whisper, I'm falling in love with you. The words hung between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm. Elena hadn't planned to say them, hadn't even fully admitted them to herself until this moment. But sitting here in her cabin with bounty hunters watching outside and a wanted man's hands in hers, pretense seemed pointless. Cord's expression shifted through surprise, gratitude, and something deeper that made Elena's breath catch. Slowly, carefully, as if afraid she might disappear, he reached up to cup her cheek. "Elena Rodriguez," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "you are the bravest, most stubborn, most incredible woman I've ever met, and I've been falling in love with you since the moment you chose to save my life instead of claiming that bounty." When he kissed her, it was gentle at first, tentative, as if testing whether this moment was real. But when Elena's arms came up around his neck, when she pressed closer, despite his healing wounds, the kiss deepened into something that spoke of desperate loneliness, finally finding solace. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Elena rested her forehead against his. "So what do we do now?" she whispered. Cord's arms tightened around her. "Now we figure out how to stay alive long enough to build a life together." Outside, storm clouds were gathering on the horizon. But inside Elena's cabin, two people who had found something precious in the midst of chaos began planning not just for escape, but for a future neither had dared to dream possible. "There's something else you should know," Cord said quietly. "My Apache uncle, Running Bear, leads a band in the sacred mountains north of here. If we can reach him, he'll give us sanctuary while we plan our next move." Elena nodded, her mind already working through the logistics. "How far?" 2 days hard ride. But first we need horses, and we need to get past Bradley's men without them knowing we've gone." Elena smiled, and there was something fierce in her expression that made Cord's heart race. "Then it's a good thing you're in love with a woman who knows every trail and waterhole within 50 miles of here." As the first rumbles of thunder echoed across the desert, Elena Rodriguez began planning her transformation from respectable healer to outlaw's woman. And for the first time in 3 years, Cord Maverick began to believe that maybe, just maybe, he'd found something worth more than all the freedom in the world. The escape plan came together over the next 2 days like pieces of an intricate puzzle. Elena had never planned to become an outlaw, but as she watched Cord's strength slowly return and saw the bounty hunters maintaining their patient vigil, she found herself surprisingly calm about the decision she'd made. "We need to make them think you're dead," Elena explained as they huddled over rough maps she'd drawn of the local terrain. "If Bradley believes Iron Wolf is finished, he'll move on to other prey." Cord studied her sketches with professional interest. What kind of evidence would convince him? Elena had been thinking about this problem since their conversation about love and justice. Blood, lots of it, and something personal that proves it came from you. "The wolf tattoo," Cord said, understanding immediately. "If Bradley found pieces of that—" "Exactly. We stage your death by the creek behind my cabin. Make it look like you bled out from your wounds and wild animals scattered the remains." Elena's mind was working through the possibilities. "I've got sheep's blood from my medical supplies. We can soak cloth with your tattoo design, cut into leather, add some torn clothing, drag marks leading into the desert." Cord stared at her with a mixture of admiration and concern. "You're thinking like an outlaw already, but it means leaving everything behind. Your practice, your reputation, your entire life." Elena looked around the cabin that had been her sanctuary for 3 years. She'd built a good life here, a respectable life. But when she looked at Cord, she realized that uncertain future with him felt more alive than all the security she was abandoning. "My life here has been about healing people and watching them leave," she said quietly. "Maybe it's time I went somewhere, instead of always being the one left behind." That night, they prepared their deception with the careful attention to detail that might mean the difference between freedom and death. Elena cut a piece of leather into the rough shape of Cord's wolf tattoo, then soaked it in sheep's blood along with strips of his torn shirt. They arranged the evidence near the creek, along with enough blood to suggest a mortal wound and drag marks that could have been made by scavengers. "Think it'll work?" Elena asked, surveying their handiwork. "Tom Bradley's good, but he's also greedy," Cord replied. "If he thinks I'm dead, he'll want proof to collect his reward." "When he finds this—" Elena nodded, then took one last look at her cabin. She'd loaded everything essential onto her horse: medical supplies, food, water, and the small amount of money she'd saved over the years. Everything else would have to stay behind. They waited until well after midnight to make their move. Elena's mare, Estrella, was a sturdy quarter horse with enough stamina for long-distance travel, though carrying two riders would slow them considerably. Cord insisted on walking for the first mile, both to spare the horse and avoid putting weight on his healing wounds. The night was clear and cold, with enough moonlight to navigate by but not so much that they'd be easily spotted. They moved carefully, taking advantage of every bit of cover the landscape offered. Elena found herself impressed by how quietly Cord could move despite his injuries. This was clearly a man who'd had plenty of practice avoiding detection. They were about 3 miles from the cabin when they heard the sound that made Elena's blood run cold. The distinctive war cry of Apache warriors, echoing across the desert from the direction they'd just come. "What's happening?" Elena whispered, her hand instinctively going to the rifle strapped to her saddle. Cord held up a hand for silence, listening intently. The war cries came again, closer this time, followed by the sound of gunfire and shouting voices. "The bounty hunters' camp," Cord said grimly. "Sounds like they just encountered some uninvited guests." Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert night. Will they be killed? Depends on how smart they are and how quickly they can get out of Apache territory. Cord's expression was hard to read in the moonlight. My mother's people don't take kindly to armed men camping without permission. They listen to the distant sounds of conflict, more gunshots, the thunder of galloping horses, gradually fading as the disturbance moved away from them. Elena found herself hoping the bounty hunters would escape alive, despite everything they represented. "Does this help or hurt our plan?" she asked. "Helps, actually. If Bradley's men are busy dealing with Apache warriors, they won't investigate our deception until tomorrow at the earliest. Gives us more of a head start." They continued their careful progress through the night, covering ground steadily if not quickly. Elena found herself studying Cord's profile in the moonlight, marveling at how completely her life had changed. 2 weeks ago, she'd been a respectable frontier healer with a quiet, predictable existence. Now she was fleeing through the desert with the most wanted man in 3 territories, her heart racing with equal parts fear and exhilaration. As dawn began to paint the eastern sky with pale gold, they reached their first destination, a hidden canyon that Elena had discovered years earlier while gathering medicinal plants. It provided natural shelter from the wind and observation, with a spring that offered fresh water. "We'll rest here through the day," Cord said, helping Elena down from Estrella. "Travel at night until we reach the sacred mountains." Elena began setting up their temporary camp, her movements efficient despite her exhaustion. "How will we find your uncle's band?" "They'll find us. Apache scouts know everything that moves in their territory." Cord touched his wolf tattoo. "This will identify me as kin, but you're another matter. White women aren't usually welcome in sacred places." "What do we do about that?" Cord was quiet for a moment, then said, "We tell them the truth. That you saved my life, that you chose love over safety, that you're my woman now." The casual way he said, "my woman," sent heat through Elena's chest. Not his property, she would never be that, but his partner, his equal, his chosen mate. "And if they don't accept me, then we'll find another way. We'll keep running until we find a place where we can be together safely." Cord moved closer to her, his hands framing her face. "I won't let anything happen to you, Elena. I promise." When he kissed her this time, it was different from their first tentative embrace. This was the kiss of 2 people who had committed to each other completely, who were partners in every sense of the word. Elena felt herself melting into him, her arms coming up to circle his neck as desire and love tangled together in her chest. They made love that morning in their hidden canyon, with the desert sunrise painting the rock walls gold and red around them. It was Elena's first time since her husband's death 5 years earlier, and Cord's first time in longer than he could remember when the act had anything to do with love instead of mere survival. Afterward, they lay tangled together on their blankets, Elena's head on Cord's chest, listening to his heartbeat steady and strong beneath her ear. "No regrets?" he asked softly, his fingers threading through her dark hair. Elena lifted her head to look at him. Ask me when we're old and gray and telling our grandchildren about the time we became outlaws for love. Cord's laugh rumbled through his chest. Grandchildren, is it? Getting a bit ahead of ourselves, aren't we? A woman can plan ahead, Elena replied, settling back against him, especially when she's found a man worth planning for. They slept through the heat of the day, taking turns keeping watch for any sign of pursuit. When evening came, they mounted up again and continued their journey north toward the sacred mountains that rose like ancient guardians against the star-filled sky. It was on their second night of travel that they encountered the Apache patrol. Elena woke from a light doze in the saddle to find Cord completely motionless beside her, his hand raised in a gesture for silence. Around them, the desert seemed empty and peaceful, but Elena could feel the weight of watching eyes. We are observed, Cord said quietly in accented English, then switched to halting Apache that Elena couldn't understand. A voice answered from the darkness, followed by the sound of horses moving. 3 Apache warriors materialized from the shadows, like ghosts becoming solid. Their rifles held ready but not aimed directly at the newcomers. The conversation that followed was entirely in Apache, with Cord's careful pronunciation answering rapid, questioning speech from the lead warrior. Elena sat perfectly still, acutely aware that her life hung in the balance of words she couldn't comprehend. Finally, the lead warrior switched to English. You are nephew to Running Bear. I am. And this is Elena, the woman who saved my life. We seek sanctuary with my uncle's people. The warrior's gaze shifted to Elena, studying her with dark eyes that missed nothing. The white woman rides with Iron Wolf Maverick. She rides with Cord Holloway, son of Running Wolf, Cord corrected firmly. The man called Iron Wolf is dead. Something passed between the two men, an understanding that went deeper than words. The warrior nodded slowly. We will take you to Running Bear. He will decide if the white woman may enter sacred ground. They were escorted through terrain that grew increasingly rugged as they climbed toward the mountains. Elena found herself in awe of the stark beauty around them, towering red rock formations that seemed to glow with their own inner light, hidden valleys carpeted with grass and wildflowers, the sense of ancient presence that hung over everything like a blessing. Just as the sun was rising on their third day of travel, they reached the Apache camp nestled in a canyon protected by towering walls and fed by a natural spring. Elena could see immediately that this was a place of power, marked by petroglyphs that spoke of generations of people who had found sanctuary here. We're here, Cord said softly, his voice filled with something Elena had never heard before, the sound of a man coming home. As they rode into the camp, Elena felt the weight of dozens of eyes upon her, some curious, some suspicious, but all assessing the white woman who had chosen to cast her lot with one of their own. At the center of the camp, a man rose from beside a fire where he'd been working on what looked like ceremonial preparations. Elena knew immediately that this was Running Bear, Cord's uncle and the leader of this band. He had the same steel-gray eyes as his nephew, the same proud bearing, but there was an ancient wisdom in his face that spoke of a life lived in harmony with powers Elena could barely imagine. My sister's son, Running Bear said in careful English, you returned to us with a white woman and blood on your trail. Uncle, Cord replied, dismounting and offering Elena his hand. This is Elena Rodriguez. She saved my life and chose love over safety. I asked sanctuary for us both. Running Bear's gaze shifted to Elena, and she felt as if he were looking straight into her soul. You would become Apache to be with this man? Elena slid down from Estrella, her legs unsteady after days of hard riding, but her voice was firm when she answered. I would become whatever I need to be to stay with the man I love. The old chief studied them both for a long moment that stretched like eternity. Then slowly, his stern expression softened into something that might have been approval. Love, he said thoughtfully, is the most powerful medicine. It makes warriors of women and fools of men. But it is also sacred, he gestured toward the deeper part of the canyon. You are welcome here, Elena Rodriguez. Rest, heal, and let us speak of how to keep you both alive long enough to enjoy this love you have found. As they were led to a shelter set apart from the others, Elena realized that for the first time since Cord had collapsed at her door, she felt truly safe. Here, in this sacred place, surrounded by people who understood the value of sanctuary, they could finally plan not just for survival, but for a future worth living. Elena woke to the sound of women's voices speaking softly in Apache, their words like music flowing over the gentle splash of water from the nearby spring. For a moment she was disoriented. The hide shelter was nothing like her cabin, and the scents around her were unfamiliar. Sage smoke, horse leather, and something that might have been juniper berries. Then she remembered. She was no longer Elena Rodriguez, the solitary healer of Deadwood Gulch. She was Elena Rodriguez, the white woman who had chosen love over safety and followed the most wanted man in 3 territories into Apache sanctuary. Cord was already gone from their sleeping robes, probably meeting with his uncle about their next move. Elena dressed quickly in her travel-stained clothes and stepped outside into a world unlike anything she'd ever experienced. The Apache camp was alive with morning activity, but it moved to rhythms entirely different from the frontier towns she knew. Children played games that seemed to involve incredible skill with small bows and arrows. Women worked at tasks Elena didn't recognize, weaving baskets with intricate patterns, preparing foods she'd never seen, tending to matters she couldn't begin to understand. And all of them watched her. Not with hostility exactly, but with the careful assessment of people deciding whether a stranger could be trusted. Elena understood. She was an outsider in their sacred space, a white woman whose presence might bring danger to people who had already sacrificed too much to the encroachment of her kind. "You are awake." The voice belonged to an elderly Apache woman who approached with the confident stride of someone accustomed to authority. She was perhaps 60, with silver-streaked hair, braided with small ornaments that caught the morning light. Her English was careful but clear. "I am Bright Star, sister to Running Bear, aunt to the one you call Cord." Elena felt a flutter of nervousness. This woman was clearly important in the camp hierarchy, and her opinion of Elena would matter greatly to their future here. "I'm honored to meet you," Elena replied, unsure of the proper protocols. Bright Star studied her with dark eyes that missed nothing. "The nephew of my heart tells us you saved his life, that you chose him over gold, over safety, over the approval of your own people." "Yes." "Why?" The question was blunt, direct, demanding truth rather than pretty words. Elena met Bright Star's gaze steadily. "Because he's a good man who was wrongly accused. Because turning him in would have been murder disguised as justice. And because," Elena paused, then continued with quiet conviction, "because I love him." Bright Star nodded slowly. "Love. This is what Running Bear tells me as well. But love is easy to speak of and hard to live with. Love between peoples who have been enemies is hardest of all." Elena felt the weight of history in those words. Generations of conflict between white settlers and native peoples, betrayals and broken treaties and blood spilled on both sides. How could she, one white woman, hope to bridge such a chasm? "I don't expect to be accepted easily," Elena said carefully. "I know my people have brought pain to yours. But I'm not asking to become Apache. I'm only asking for the chance to prove that some white people can be trusted, that some of us are capable of keeping our word." Something shifted in Bright Star's expression. Not warmth exactly, but a lessening of the rigid assessment. "Come, you will help with the morning meal, and we will see what kind of woman has captured the heart of Running Wolf's grandson." The next several hours were education and cultural immersion. Elena found herself working alongside Apache women who showed her how to prepare foods she'd never imagined. Ground acorn meal mixed with berries, meat dried in ways that preserved it for months, teas brewed from plants that grew only in these sacred mountains. Her medical knowledge proved unexpectedly valuable. When one of the children scraped his knee in a fall, Elena's quick, competent treatment impressed the watching mothers. When an elderly man complained of joint pain, her knowledge of willow bark and other natural remedies earned nods of approval. "You have healing hands," observed a woman called Dancing Water, as Elena bandaged the child's knee. "This is good medicine." "My father taught me," Elena replied. "He said healing was a sacred calling, that it made no difference who needed help, white or Indian, rich or poor, good or bad. Pain was pain, and it was a healer's duty to relieve it." "Your father was wise," Dancing Water said. Perhaps he would have made a good Apache. It was, Elena realized, the highest compliment she could have received. As the day progressed, Elena began to understand the complex social structure of the band. Running Bear was clearly the leader, but decisions seemed to be made through consensus rather than decree. The women had their own counsel and considerable influence over matters affecting the entire group. Children were treasured and protected, but also expected to contribute according to their abilities. It was a way of life that emphasized community over individual gain, harmony over conflict, respect for the natural world over domination of it. Elena found herself thinking that if all white settlements operated on these principles, the frontier might be a very different place. When evening came, she was invited to join the circle around the central fire, where Running Bear was speaking with Cord and several other men. The conversation was partly in English, partly in Apache, but Elena gathered they were discussing the situation with the bounty hunters and what should be done next. "The men who hunt you believe Iron Wolf is dead," Running Bear was saying. "Our scouts report they found your false trail and accepted it. They have left the territory, seeking easier prey." Elena felt a surge of relief. Their deception had worked. "But this is only temporary safety," Running Bear continued. "There will be others. The white man's law offers much gold for your capture, and gold makes men foolish with greed." "I know," Cord replied. "Elena and I can't stay here indefinitely. We need a more permanent solution." "There is a way," Running Bear said slowly, "but it requires great courage and absolute trust." Elena leaned forward, sensing this was the crucial moment they'd been building toward. "A white lawman came to me 3 moons ago," Running Bear explained. "A deputy marshal named Wheeler. He seeks to learn the truth about the crimes you are accused of. He believes you were betrayed, framed by the very corruption you tried to fight." Cord's expression sharpened. "Wheeler came here. How did he find you?" "The same way you did, by following the old trails your mother once walked. He carries credentials from the territorial governor, and his heart speaks truth. He has been investigating the death of Vincent Hardwick for many months." Elena felt her pulse quicken. A federal lawman who believed in Cord's innocence could change everything. "What does he want?" she asked. "He wants Cord to testify about what he knew of Hardwick's crimes. In exchange, he will provide proof that Cord was framed for the murder." Running Bear's expression grew serious. "But first, Iron Wolf Maverick must die completely and convincingly. Not just to fool bounty hunters, but to fool the men who framed him." "A public death," Cord said slowly, understanding. "Witnessed and verified." "Yes, Wheeler has a plan, but it requires both of you to trust him with your lives. Literally." Elena reached for Cord's hand, their fingers intertwining automatically. "What kind of plan?" Running Bear smiled, and there was something almost wolfish in the expression. "The kind that turns the hunters into the hunted. The kind that gives you both new lives while bringing justice to the men who destroyed your old ones." Over the next hour, Running Bear outlined Wheeler's proposal. It was audacious, dangerous, and required precise timing. But if it worked, Cord would be legally declared dead, while the real criminals faced justice. Elena and Cord could start new lives with new identities, free to love each other without constantly looking over their shoulders. "There's risk," Running Bear warned. "If any part fails, you both die for real. Wheeler cannot protect you if the deception is discovered." Elena looked at Cord, seeing her own thoughts reflected in his eyes. They'd already risked everything for love. This was simply the next step. "When?" Cord asked. "Next week. Wheeler will arrange for Iron Wolf to be captured in a very public way. There will be a gunfight. Iron Wolf will die, witnessed by multiple people. But Cord Maverick and Elena Rodriguez will live to become new people." "What new people?" Elena asked. Running Bear's smile widened. "That you will decide together. Wheeler has connections who can provide papers, histories, anything you need to start fresh." That night, Elena and Cord lay together in their shelter, talking quietly about the future Wheeler's plan might give them. "Are you frightened?" Cord asked, his arms tightening around her. "Terrified," Elena admitted, "but also hopeful. For the first time since this all began, I can actually imagine us having a normal life. Maybe even what?" Elena's hand moved to rest flat against her stomach, where she'd begun to suspect a new life might be taking root. She hadn't told Cord yet, It was too early to be certain, and they had too many immediate dangers to worry about. But the possibility filled her with a fierce joy that surprised her with its intensity. Maybe even a family, she said softly. Cord was quiet for a long moment. Then he rolled over to face her, his eyes intense in the flickering firelight from outside their shelter. Elena Rodriguez, he said, his voice thick with emotion. When this is over, when we're free to be whoever we choose to be, will you marry me? Not for survival or necessity, but because you want to build a life with me? Elena's heart swelled until she thought it might burst from her chest. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I'll marry you. Whoever we become, wherever we go, yes. As they kissed in the darkness of their borrowed shelter, surrounded by the protection of people who had accepted their love, Elena allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, fairy tale endings were possible even for outlaws. Outside, the sacred mountains stood guard over sleeping lovers, and in the distance, a deputy marshal named Wheeler was putting the finishing touches on a plan that would either set them free forever or destroy them both. But tonight, in this moment, Elena and Cord were simply two people in love, planning a future that seemed as bright and infinite as the star-filled sky above their sanctuary. The morning of Iron Wolf Maverick's planned death dawned clear and cold over the Arizona territory. Deputy Marshal William Wheeler stood on the ridge overlooking Deadwood Gulch, his weathered hands adjusting the field glasses as he studied the town below. Everything had to be perfect. One mistake, one witness who saw too much or too little, and both Elena and Cord would die for real. Wheeler was a careful man, methodical in the way that came from 20 years of federal law enforcement. He'd built his reputation on attention to detail and an unwavering commitment to justice, qualities that had made him perfect for this particular assignment. The territorial governor had personally selected him to investigate the Hardwick case, sensing that corruption ran too deep for local authorities to handle. What Wheeler had discovered in his months of investigation would have shaken most men's faith in the system. Vincent Hardwick's network of bribes, threats, and outright murder had infected every level of law enforcement, from local sheriffs to federal marshals. The frame-up of Deputy Marshal Cord Maverick had been just one small piece of a much larger puzzle of corruption and greed. But today, if everything went according to plan, justice would finally be served. Wheeler lowered his field glasses and checked his pocket watch. Noon exactly. Time to begin the performance that would either set two innocent people free or get them all killed. In the Apache camp, Elena finished braiding her hair with hands that trembled only slightly. She'd insisted on dressing as herself one last time, Elena Rodriguez, frontier healer, before becoming whoever she and Cord would choose to be in their new life. The simple blue dress and worn leather boots represented everything she was leaving behind. Cord stood near the entrance of their shelter, checking and rechecking his weapons. For the plan to work, he had to be convincing as the desperate outlaw making his final stand. Every detail mattered: the way he held his guns, the defiance in his voice, the precise choreography of the fight that would end with Iron Wolf's death. "You remember everything?" he asked Elena, though they'd rehearsed this dozens of times. "Wheeler's posse arrives from the east at exactly noon. You'll be hiding in the old mine shaft. I'll be your hostage, scared and pleading." Elena's voice was steady despite the fear churning in her stomach. "When the shooting starts, I drop behind the rocks and stay hidden until it's over. And if something goes wrong—" "Nothing will go wrong," Elena interrupted, stepping close to cup his face in her hands. "We've planned this too carefully. Wheeler's men know exactly what to do. By tonight, Iron Wolf Maverick will be dead and buried, and we'll be free to start our new life." Cord leaned into her touch, drawing strength from her unwavering confidence. "I love you, Elena Rodriguez." "I love you too, Cord Maverick. But after today, we'll love each other as different people entirely." They kissed then, soft and lingering, tasting goodbye to their old selves. At exactly 11:30, Elena and Cord mounted their horses and rode out of the Apache camp. Running Bear and Bright Star watched them go with expressions of stoic acceptance. They'd done all they could to protect these two lovers. Now it was up to Wheeler's plan and the spirits that watched over those who fought for justice. The old Esperanza silver mine was perfect for their purposes. Close enough to town that the gunfight would have plenty of witnesses, but isolated enough that Wheeler could control exactly who saw what. Elena and Cord took their positions just as the sound of approaching horses echoed off the canyon walls. Wheeler's posse appeared exactly on schedule. 6 men in federal marshal badges, their rifles ready, their faces grim with purpose. Wheeler himself rode at the front, every inch the dedicated lawman pursuing a dangerous fugitive. Iron Wolf Maverick, Wheeler's voice carried clearly across the desert. This is Deputy Marshal Wheeler. You're surrounded. Release your hostage and surrender. Cord stepped into view, his arm around Elena's throat, his gun pressed to her temple. Even knowing it was an act, Elena felt her heart race at how completely he transformed into the desperate outlaw. Stay back, Cord shouted, his voice harsh with manufactured panic. I'll kill her if you come any closer. Let the woman go, Maverick. She's got nothing to do with this. She's my ticket out of here. Cord began backing toward the mine entrance, dragging Elena with him. Try to stop me and she dies. The choreography was perfect. Wheeler's men spread out in a classic flanking pattern, while Cord retreated into the rocky terrain around the mine. Elena played her part flawlessly, whimpering and struggling just enough to look convincing without actually interfering with Cord's movements. Then came the moment they'd practiced most carefully. As Cord reached the mine entrance, Elena broke free and dove behind a boulder exactly as planned. Cord spun, raising his weapons toward Wheeler's men, and the canyon erupted in gunfire. Watching from her hiding place, Elena saw the bullets strike sparks off the rocks around Cord as he returned fire with the desperate accuracy of a man fighting for his life. One of Wheeler's men cried out and clutched his shoulder, a flesh wound, carefully planned and perfectly executed. The gunfight lasted perhaps 30 seconds, though it felt like hours to Elena. Then she heard Cord's voice, weaker now, gasping as if mortally wounded. You got me, he called out, his words carrying a note of defeat. But I ain't going back to hang. The final shot came from Cord's own gun, fired into the air, but timed perfectly with his collapse behind the rocks. To anyone watching from a distance, Iron Wolf Maverick had just taken his own life rather than face capture. Elena forced herself to remain hidden as Wheeler and his men approached the mine entrance. The marshal's voice carried clearly in the sudden silence. He's dead. Single gunshot to the head, self-inflicted. Wheeler's tone was appropriately grim. Iron Wolf Maverick won't be terrorizing this territory anymore. But Elena knew better. Hidden in the rocks behind where Cord had fallen, a narrow crevice led to an abandoned mine tunnel. Cord was already making his way through that tunnel toward their predetermined meeting point, very much alive despite being officially dead. Wheeler's men spent the next hour carefully documenting the scene, taking photographs and collecting evidence that would satisfy territorial authorities. The body they eventually recovered from the mine shaft was real enough, an Apache warrior who had died of fever 3 days earlier, similar enough in build to pass for Iron Wolf in death. By evening, word had spread throughout Deadwood Gulch and beyond. The notorious outlaw Iron Wolf Maverick was finally dead, killed in a dramatic gunfight with federal marshals. The $5,000 bounty would remain unclaimed, but the territory was safe from his depredations. Elena and Cord met that night at an abandoned line shack 20 miles from the mine, both of them giddy with relief and disbelief. They'd done it. Iron Wolf Maverick was dead, and they were free. How does it feel to be a dead man? Elena asked as they sat by a small fire, finally allowing themselves to believe it was over. Strange, Cord admitted. I've been Iron Wolf for so long, I'd almost forgotten who I was before. Now I get to find out who I can become. Wheeler arrived just before midnight, carrying saddlebags full of documentation that would transform them from outlaws into respectable citizens. Birth certificates, marriage records, property deeds, everything they needed to establish themselves as Thomas and Maria Santos, recent arrivals from New Mexico territory. The governor's people have been thorough, Wheeler explained as he spread the papers across their makeshift table. As far as anyone will know, you've been married for 2 years and are looking to start fresh in a new territory. There's even a house waiting for you in Esperanza, small town about 50 miles south, where no one will ask too many questions about your past. Elena studied the marriage certificate with wonder. Maria Elena Santos, wife of Thomas James Santos. The names felt foreign on her tongue, but they also felt like hope. "What about Elena Rodriguez?" she asked. "What happens to her?" "She died helping the notorious Iron Wolf, tragically caught in the crossfire during his final gunfight," Wheeler replied solemnly. "The official report will show that she was an innocent victim, not an accomplice. Her memory will be respected." That detail mattered more to Elena than she'd expected. The people of Deadwood Gulch had known her as a healer, someone who helped anyone who needed it. She didn't want that legacy tainted by her association with Iron Wolf. "And the real criminals?" Cord asked. "The men who framed me, already in custody. The evidence you provided about Hardwick's operation was exactly what we needed. Sheriff Morrison, Judge Blackwood, even some federal marshals. They're all going to stand trial." Wheeler's smile was grim with satisfaction. "Justice may be slow, but it's coming." 3 months later, the small frontier town of Esperanza welcomed its newest residents with the cautious warmth reserved for respectable settlers. Thomas Santos was known as an honest horse trader, an occasional deputy, while his wife Maria was quickly establishing herself as the finest healer in 3 counties. They built a good life together, these two people who had been reborn from the ashes of their former selves. Thomas Santos bore little resemblance to the haunted outlaw who had once been Iron Wolf Maverick. Maria Santos was warmer, more open than Elena Rodriguez had ever allowed herself to be. And when Maria discovered she was carrying their first child, both of them understood that this new life growing within her represented the future they'd fought so hard to claim. A future built not on the shadows of their past, but on the foundation of love that had sustained them through their darkest hours. The autumn wedding that would officially unite Thomas and Maria Santos in the eyes of their new community was just a formality. In every way that mattered, they'd been married since the moment Elena Rodriguez had chosen to save a dying stranger's life, setting in motion a chain of events that had transformed them both. As Maria walked down the aisle of the converted barn that served as Esperanza's chapel, her hand resting on the gentle swell of her belly, she thought about the incredible journey that had brought them here. From that dawn when she'd found a wounded outlaw at her door to this perfect morning when she was marrying the man she loved, surrounded by people who accepted them for who they'd chosen to become. The past was buried with Iron Wolf Maverick. The future belonged to Thomas and Maria Santos, and to the children who would carry their love forward into a world where justice had finally prevailed. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Morrison began, and Maria smiled at the wonderful ordinariness of it all. No bounty hunters, no desperate escapes, no bullets flying in the desert darkness. Just a simple frontier wedding, blessing a love that had survived everything the harsh world could throw at it. When Thomas's lips met hers in their first kiss as husband and wife, Maria thought that sometimes the most perfect endings required the most imperfect beginnings. Sometimes love had to be forged in fire before it could truly shine. And sometimes, if you were very lucky and very brave, you could die to your old life and be reborn into something beautiful beyond imagining. And that, friends, is how two lost souls found each other in the harsh wilderness of the American frontier, and how love conquered even the most impossible odds. Elena Rodriguez and Cord Maverick sacrificed everything they'd been to become Thomas and Maria Santos. Proof that sometimes the greatest courage isn't in fighting your enemies, but in trusting someone else with your heart. Their story reminds us that justice may be slow, but it's patient. That love doesn't always follow the rules, but it always finds a way. And that sometimes the most wanted thing in the world isn't gold or glory. It's simply someone who sees you for who you really are and chooses to stand by your side. If you love this story of frontier justice, passionate romance, and second chances, make sure to hit that like button and let us know in the comments what touched you most about Elena and Cord's incredible journey. Was it Elena's courage in choosing love over safety? Cord's determination to clear his name? Or maybe the way the Apache people opened their hearts to protect these two lovers? And don't forget to subscribe and ring that notification bell for more epic tales from the Wild West. We've got stories of mail-order brides finding unexpected love, ranchers standing up to corrupt cattle barons, and settlers building new lives on the vast American frontier. Each tale is filled with the same passion, courage, and hope that made Elena and Thomas's story so unforgettable. Because at the end of the day, That's what the American West was really about. People brave enough to risk everything for the chance at something better. So saddle up, partners, and join us next time for another adventure where love conquers all and justice rides again across the endless prairie. Until then, remember what Elena and Cord taught us. True love is worth any risk, and the strongest people are those who fight not just for themselves, but for each other. The frontier is calling, and your next favorite love story is just one click away.